This video came about as an adaptation of a conference presentation which Ed Rowe and I did. I'll call him Mickey throughout the video here. In San Francisco for the Public Administration Theory Network. The panel that we joined was about utopian ideals, and so what we talked about in our presentation was the idea of utopia being unbound, and we need to redescribe the discourse that happens within marginalized communities. And so let me start by telling you what started this, because we listened to the inaugural address of President Obama, and he mentioned from Seneca Falls, through Seneca Falls and Selma and Stonewall, and the idea that the civil rights movement now had these three iconic place names in it is what started us talking about this. Seneca Falls was, I think everybody had to Google or look up Seneca Falls. I did. I found out that it was in 1848, and this was the convention which women had, and it's really foundational, and it's a benchmark and the starting point of the women's suffrage movement. What Mickey and I look at when we look at these events, is we look at what is the sustaining institution that created the obstacles for these movements. What were they up against? What did they have to unravel in order to have these movements? When we look at women, it can be argued that it was culture and tradition. And it still perpetuates to this day that when a male is in when a male is a boss and he has an authority, when he has authority and he's in an authority position, he is seen as the boss. They recognize the authority. But when a woman claims that authority, she is seen as bossy. These are narratives which we want to talk about in this video. So this is the diagram which we have. Culture and tradition is the sustaining institution which we have to overcome. And that is what's perpetuated and protected this narrative that women are homemakers. So it's an interpretive monopoly. People who are part of this sustaining institution want everybody to see only one way to interpret a woman's role, and that's what I call an interpretive monopoly. That's a narrative community that we're talking about. As a group, as a whole, what keeps that conversation about women being homemakers is that narrative community. I'll turn it over to Mickey.
Okay, in 1965, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge was a pinnacle turning point in the civil rights movement. And it was talked about once again by President Obama in his inaugural address after his second election. But there's something that seemed to be missing from that when he put the connection with Selma and Seneca along with Stonewall. And it didn't feel just quite right.
Did you want to take this, or did you want me to explain this? These are my diagrams because I'm the one who sits.
Just do it. Don't explain it. Just do it.
All right. So zero-sum thinking. What my research has shown over the past 6 years is that we can call this sustaining institution zero-sum thinking. The idea that if the Negro got anything at all, something was taken away from the white person. This is the narrative. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 took something from whites. The idea that there wasn't enough in America to share kept them going on this idea that, oh, okay, if we give them anything, meaning them being the other people, and this is that out-group down here, then we've lost something.
And the key point to that is those individuals who were taught that narrative already were at the bottom of the receiving end, but they needed a foil, and that foil became minorities, and particularly African Americans. If we give them something, you lose something. Well, what did you lose? You don't have it now. But that was lost somewhere in the narrative.
And that's the power of hegemony, and we talk about this in other videos. We're not going to get into it in this one here, is that the idea that people in authority who have an authority position, who want to keep one side, typically a majority, or the side that has had power, in power, then you have to pit one group against the other. And so the poor whites were told that they're poor, and they're going to get worse off if they allow the blacks to get anything.
No, they were told they would never achieve the American dream and have what the others had if you allow this group of interlopers to come in and take what's yours. Zero-sum thinking.
And so Stonewall came along in 1969. The idea that, once again, an oppressed group decided to push back and fight back and claim their rights. And so this idea that the gay community had to actually claim their right and they had to stand up and fight for it is what made Stonewall the benchmark. What they were fighting against in that sustaining institution was the religious-based bigotry, the idea that being gay is a lifestyle choice. That bar, the Stonewall Inn, was a bar that was operated illegally by the mafia. The cops were being paid off in order to keep the bar in business, but this was the lifestyle choice. They chose that seedy lifestyle. They had to go into seedy back streets.
And every so often, just so that the police could exert their authority and remind the mafia, who was in really control, not really the mafia, the police, they would then stage a raid on the bar. And this happened perpetually. And it was always an embarrassment for those gentlemen or women who were in the bar because they were exposed. Many times they were arrested. Their names were listed in the newspaper. And this was a perpetual bit of bullying that went on with the New York City Police.
And that push to keep it in the seediest and worst off neighborhoods where was based on this idea that, that's their lifestyle. They want that lifestyle.
And primarily, as a side, most gay bars through the 60s and even into this day are in minority neighborhoods or on the outskirts of minority neighborhoods, in particularly African-American neighborhoods in major cities.
Yeah, keep your lifestyle out of my sight. And so when we came, and when the gay community claimed their space, and when the African Americans claimed their rights, and when women claimed their rights, these are all now part of America's history in the civil rights struggle. And that's what they were saying. That's what President Obama mentioned in his inaugural address. Our journey is not complete, meaning that we have a third civil rights struggle now. But something about that didn't seem right.
It bothered me greatly because I sat back and looked, and as a man of color and also a gay man, I looked at the movement and I thought, how has this changed for me as a gay black male? And I looked for the one sustaining thread that ran through the gay rights movement and what that meant that would allow them to have the success that black people have had eluded them for 40 years, 50 years, and the one sustaining thread is white males.
When I saw the cover of the Time magazine come up and it said gay marriage is already won, I thought, oh wow, we've already declared victory. And it wasn't really, it didn't feel like it was inappropriate because it really did feel like a victory. Just about every gay couple in America was impacted by the decision on June 28th of 2013 when the Supreme Court declared that DOMA was unconstitutional. So that victory was not experienced, that same kind of a victory, we've never had that deciding moment. When we had Brown versus the Board of Education, and then we had the Civil Rights Act. Really, how was that felt in the inner city?
It wasn't even felt by me as a gay man because I was still a black man. So while this may have relieved me of some of the issues or the beginning of a relief of the issues about being gay, I still have to deal each day with being a black in this United States, and in particularly a black male.
And really, after Mickey and I started talking about that, Matt Bomer came out about that time, and we had to think about how tremendously successful his career was up until he came out, because before he was a white gay male, he was always a white male. And so the white male community very willingly embraced Matt Bomer as, he's one of us because we've always known him as one of us, and now we just know one thing more about him, and he's gay.
And the marginalization that he feels from being gay is minuscule compared to the marginalization I feel as an African-American male who is gay, or it's for women that matter in our society.
Yeah, we can go back to the Seneca Falls reference that President Obama made. We've had women in increasing numbers, and I think this is the largest number we've ever had in Congress for women being elected. But for 10 years, the wage gap has never closed. So women are making some strides in saying, we'll give you a wink and a nod, but how is it really felt in the lives of everyday women? So now let's take a look specifically at what happened for African Americans and why that narrative feels different about Selma than it does for Seneca Falls and Stonewall. Things haven't changed for black children to that degree. Black children are still by far the largest group of impoverished children in America.
And when you compare that against the fact that we have either legal or illegal immigrants of Hispanic background who are here, and yet still the numbers are smaller, that should tell you something about the disparity for African Americans who have been in this country since the 1500s.
And that's really what we want to start the conversation about, is that structural racism. The idea that it's embedded somewhere in the structure, that Hispanics don't face that same kind of obstacle. And one thing that really also underscores this is the idea that that people, when an African American child is seen with, well, this one news story came out. A fellow went shopping with his 3 children. His wife is African American, and of course the children are biracial. And so he got questioned by authorities because somebody in the store reported him to the security that he shouldn't.
That he may have had these little girls and they were not his little girls, and why did he have them, with the potential of him being a child molester.
Yeah, and so then just recently now, just before we're filming this video, another news story broke.
About 2 African American men who are gay, who have 3 children. They have a biological mother who was a surrogate, and they have these 3 children, and they have an Instagram that people have been following. And the vilification of these 2 young black men who have elected to have 3 children and to raise them, financially support them, has been overwhelming. And yet and still, the fact that if it were 2 white males with 3 black children, they might get some vitriol from the public, but it wouldn't be nearly as bad as it has been for 2 African American males. And in particular, some of this vilification has come from the African American community, which is perplexing in as much as we already get so much from everyone else. Why would we do this to ourselves?
Yeah. And so there seems to be this double standard, and that's what we want to change. And that's why we want to talk about how narratives, specifically about discourse structuration. And one thing really drove that home. Well, let me tell you about when I was in Prague, Czech Republic, and the lilacs were in bloom.
When Lester was in Prague going to another conference, he got on what's it called?
The equivalent of Skype on an iPhone. FaceTime.
What was it? Yeah, we were on FaceTime talking, and he happened to mention to me that the lilacs were in bloom, and that lilacs were his mother, Flora's, favorite flower. And I said, oh my gosh, I said, my mother, Ernestine, loved lilacs too. She loved lilac bushes. And so after he and I had lived together now for, at that point, 6 years, we had just discovered there was a commonality between our 2 mothers. They both loved lilacs.
And we asked ourselves, if we had lived in the same town, would our parents, would our mothers specifically have ever met each other? And if they would have met each other, would have these circumstances been favorable for them to become friends?
And what are the things that they have in common besides the fact that we had this new discovery about lilacs? They were both very committed to their families. They were both very religious individuals. They had a lot in common, and they were female. The difference? Color.
And so when you talk about discourse structuration and you're looking at things with a narrative through a narrative lens, you have to ask yourself, okay, we want to first off talk about the idea that there's an ostensive view and a performative view of when you look at narratives. An ostensive view is like setting the table. When you set the table and walk out of the room, the table is still set. And so that's an ostensive view. It's cast in stone, and when you come back, the table will be just like you left it. And so when you look at things through an ostensive lens, what Flora and Ernestine would have been up against is this idea that white women, even in Muncie and even in my community, did not associate with minority women. My hometown is in Cardston, Alberta, which is right on the edge of the largest Indian reservation in Canada. And so the white community did not associate too much with the Indian community in Cardston. And I was 11 years old before I rode an elevator. I was 13 years old before I ever saw my first black man. And so this kind of sheltering is what keeps narratives in place. It's that culture, it's that sustaining institution that says, you know what, things have always been this way, they have to remain that way.
Right. And my mother's profound narrative would have been, first of all, as an African-American woman, having to edge out or eke out an existence, she would have been forced to have to work in the white community, either as a secretary or as a maid. She would have been forced to interact with whites, where whites would not necessarily have been forced to interact within the black community. So her narrative would have been that that was a situation for her, which meant she moved outside her area of comfort each time she had to leave the black community. Muncie, Indiana is located 60 miles from Indianapolis, which is the capital of Indiana. And not that far northeast or northwest of Muncie is a little town called...
Starts with a C?
It's terrible. I forgot the name of it.
Elwood.
Elwood. Yes, there's a little town called Elwood, Indiana, where the grand dragon of the KKK lived. My father would go to Indianapolis and spend an extra hour on the road to take us north toward Chicago so he did not have to go through Elwood, because Elwood was the site of the last nationally known lynching in 1930, for which the song Strange Fruit that Billie Holiday recorded was based on.
And so one thing that Mickey also learned at a very young age.
When I was a little boy, about 7 years of age, my brother had gone to summer school at Ball State, which is the university in my hometown, and he was an exceptional student. Exceptional back then meant you were very smart. Did not mean that you had a learning disability. He had graduated, along with other people in his class, from a science symposium that summer. So we had gone as a family to a social gathering, an ice cream social, as part of the graduation program. There was a little girl who was the same age as me. Her sister was in my brother's class, and so they were making ice cream sundaes. She and I approached the little ice cream area together, and being children, started to talk and play. We mixed a black cow, Coca-Cola over ice cream, and made one for us to eat. We walked back to sit down on the ground to have it. We both had spoons, and as we were eating it, her mother walked up and snatched her off the ground and walked away with her. That evening, my mother had to explain to me that the young lady had acted that way because the mother had acted that way because I was black and we were eating from the same ice cream cup.
And this is why I want to go back to the ostensive view of a narrative and a performative view. Narratives really are performed. That young girl's mother performed a narrative that white girls, even at a very, very young age, do not associate with black boys. And so these narratives are not ostensive, but they like to pretend they are. These sustaining institutions that are down here that say things have always been this way and they should remain this way are trying to argue for the ostensive view. But the performative view is the truth. It's a social construct that we have to keep our young girls, our young white girls, away from black boys. And so that's the difference between an ostensive view and a performative view. So the solution to this, which we really want to get into, and this is where we get into the meat of the theory here, is this contact hypothesis, which Gordon Allport put together right after Brown versus Board of Education. Did you want to take this on?
No.
Okay.
I don't even know what it is.
The contact hypothesis, when Gordon Allport, as a social psychologist, saw the ruling come down on Brown versus Board of Education and the fact that the military needed to be brought in, the National Guard needed to be brought in order to enforce a new narrative about how education would be approached in the South, Gordon Allport argued that 4 major points could be undertaken in order to overcome prejudice. If we could do these 4 things, we would overcome that prejudice. It was later adapted to a 6-point idea, which we'll get into. But what this really comes down to, and what you're up against as a social psychologist, which is really getting thick in the weeds here, is a principle called terror management theory. Davis, Jewell, and Rutledge talked about this in 2010 about what makes people afraid of a changing narrative. What is it, this worldview threat that's right in the middle of this, between the performative view and the ostensive view of narratives?
And the idea is you don't have to get that thick in the weeds to understand terror management theory. It's used all the time. The NSA, they're looking in your things, terror management. If they move into our neighborhood, property values go down, terror management. So it's anytime a narrative is used to frighten individuals so that they stop association with someone or they stop someone from gaining something, once again, it's hand in hand with zero-sum thinking. If they get this, you lose something. Zero-sum thinking in and of itself is part of terror management theory.
Anything that can make people afraid will make them stop change. And that's what this is all about. We need to stop the narratives from changing. And so the way out of this, and really where this connects back to our mothers, is the idea of creating some kind of a new narrative community. We can't attack. Hugh Miller talks about the fact that we cannot. What's the word? Escaped my mind. We should not be trying to deconstruct these interpretive monopolies. They're the sustaining institution protects them and very, very aggressively defends them. And so we cannot deconstruct them because we're up against that fear. So the idea is to create an emergent narrative community that comes out between the two communities so that we avoid that terror management theory. If we can stop people from being defensive, then we'll find a way forward by leaving their old beliefs intact and creating a new, comfortable space for them.
Think of the Wright brothers. No one can fly without wings.
There you go, exactly. So the idea of creating, and this is really where we come back to through Seneca Falls and Selma and Stonewall, is we came through those periods by creating emergent narrative communities that, you know what, women do deserve the right to vote. African Americans do deserve integrated schools, and gays and lesbians do deserve the right to equality in marriage. And so these emergent narrative communities, which I'm just putting on the board here, the idea that you create new ways of seeing the world without deconstructing the old sheltered history, which people like to believe was their true history. People want to hold on to the idea that they had a capital T truth in their history, but we can move them forward into these new emergent communities by making them think of things in a different way. So what happens when we try to get people to think that if we try and explain away the idea that, you know what, it's not a zero-sum game, we need to make a bigger tent and everybody can live in this bigger tent, blacks in America are structurally disadvantaged, threatens the idea that, oh, they're taking something away from me. So how do we move forward out of that? Well, one idea that worked for the gay community was everybody started to get to know somebody else who was gay, and 32% of people changed their mind about the gay and lesbian community because they came to know somebody who was gay. So when we look at emergent narrative communities, and specifically looking at the LGBT, the gay and lesbian community gaining so much ground so quickly, 32% of the people said they changed their mind about the entire gay community because they knew somebody who was gay. Is that going to work for African Americans?
Well, the problem with African Americans is the fact that while someone may change their idea about the entire gay population or the majority of the gay population because of their knowing someone, having a frame of reference, that doesn't necessarily work for African Americans because they tend to be selective in how they look at us. They look at us on an individual basis. If you ask most whites and even blacks to name 5 famous people that they know that are black, they would name the very same 5 that we all learned about in school. It would be George Washington Carver, Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, so on and so on and so, Sojourner Truth. They're considered to be exceptions. They're not representative of the entire black population. Unfortunately, that does transfer over for gays and lesbians oftentimes because people have been able to accept that collective idea that more people are like this individual I know than not. That doesn't transfer over or translate to African Americans the same way. We are generally looked at as being not ordinary Negroes.
Yeah, it's like picking somebody out of a crowd of undesirable people and saying, oh, okay, we're going to pick this person out because he's desirable to us now, but they're still all undesirable.
Right. If you remember when President Obama was a candidate for president, and they asked Joe Biden, who would then be his vice president during the election, or would be his vice presidential candidate down the road. When they asked him what he thought of him, he said, oh, he's intelligent, he's clean, he's well-spoken. That made him not an ordinary Negro.
And so that's really what happened, and that's when everybody says, oh, everything's going to be fine now because we've elected our first black president. Well, in the minds of many people out there, we've elected somebody who was not an ordinary Negro. And so they're still keeping that old narrative in their mind that the rest of them are taking something from us.
And yet and still, they elected him for not being an ordinary Negro, but his administration has been treated as anything but.
Yeah, ordinary. And the fact that, and this is what Mickey and I debate about all the time, is that if we can stop this exceptional Negro from getting anything really monumental accomplished, then we will have put him in his place,
right,
which is continuing to other.
Which then muddles the American dream because the American dream was a suggestion. It really wasn't a fulfillment.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that we're dealing with media and social constructionisms and this trying to create a new narrative, we have to work with media in order to create a new narrative. And you have to be very creative now, and that's what we're trying to do with the Moxie systems, is we're trying to be far more creative than anybody else has ever done on attacking and taking on social constructionism. Social psychology came in revised by Aronson, Wilson, and Akert. They came up with 6 points. They expanded on Gordon Alpert's 4 points. And so we looked at this from how Flora and Ernestine, our mothers, would have implemented, or how somebody might have been able to implement these 6 points of social contact hypothesis to get our mothers together. Mutual independence, mutual interdependence between my mother and Mickey's mother would have required some engineering. A common goal would have also required some engineering. And when I talk about some engineering, I mean apply some creative media idea where we could bring this contact and engineer this contact. Equal status, our mothers would have been fine with that, I believe. I don't think my mother was ever racist in any central core context. She was just in a community that didn't give her any opportunities to meet anybody other than other white women. This informal interpersonal contact, that would have required some engineering, but we would have needed to do that because that's where they would have found out that their favorite flower is the lilac.
Well, back to your point about equal status, I don't think that's necessarily true because people have learned biases. And the learned biases may not be through his experience, but once again, it goes back to terror management. And my mother was as afraid of whites as whites may have been afraid of my mother, because my mother learned early on, and we were taught the same way, that white people were dangerous to your survival and existence, and you had to be very careful when dealing with whites because whites could take something from you, in particularly what freedoms you did have or your life.
Yeah. And I think about that as well on the ostensive view of narratives. My mother, Flora, would have had a subconscious idea that the narrative was ostensive. This is the way it's always been, and I'm not going to challenge that because why should I? I live in a white community.
And she was a woman, and women don't challenge the status quo.
Yeah, exactly. So it was double against them both. And so this idea of creating multiple contacts, this would have occurred naturally, I think, between my mother and Mickey's mother. But that social norms of equality in my community did not exist, and in Muncie,
as I said before, my mother was forced and my father were forced to go outside the black community. If you wanted to have any sort of sustenance and any kind of survival financially, you had to enter into the white community to do work for them. So we were forced to move into it, but they were never forced to move into ours. Right. Once again, their interaction with blacks was selective, and you became exceptional or not ordinary because you became a part of their family, but everyone else like you did not.
With Cardston being on the edge of the largest Indian reservation in Canada, the Indians were invited into our community to do business, and then you went back home to live. But you were allowed to come in during the day, but don't try and buy any houses.
You can come in and spend your money, but don't think you're welcome.
So this idea that the favorite flower, if we could get our mothers to, if we could have engineered a way for our mothers to have all 6 points of that contact hypothesis work in their lives, is where we want to go. And that's what we want to get creative about with the Moxie systems. And I really appreciate watching this video. There's about 15 others on the webpage that get into a whole lot more, and especially I would invite you to watch the overview video.
And this will be much better very soon.